If you can't act like a sterling, you can start paying rent for the air you breathe in this house. My father, Garrett Sterling, didn't just say it, he spat it, sliding a DNA diagnostic kit from Genetics Direct across the polished mahogany table right between the honey-glazed ham and the $45 bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet. 22 relatives froze, forks suspended in midair, the ambient noise of a high-society dinner party dying into a suffocating silence. My brother Tyler let out a jagged, mocking laugh and high-fived him, the heavy gold links of his $1,200 Cuban link bracelet clinking against the wood. My mother Evelyn suddenly found the intricate blue and gold pattern on her Wedgwood china fascinating, her knuckles white as she gripped her wine glass, the liquid trembling within the crystal. I didn't flinch. My name is Cassidy Sterling. I'm 31 years old, a senior surgical nurse at a Level 1 trauma center in Charlotte, North Carolina. I have spent my career witnessing the absolute fragility of human life, and yet nothing I have seen in an operating room was as clinical or as cold as the expression on the man who called himself my father. The air in the dining room of the Sterling estate in Myers Park was thick with the scent of rosemary, expensive perfume, and the kind of tension that precedes a structural collapse. This house, a $6 million Georgian colonial with its manicured hedges and weeping willows, had always felt less like a home and more like a stage where we were forced to perform. To the outside world, Garrett Sterling was a titan of local industry, the man who built Sterling Logistics from a 3-truck operation into a fleet that dominated the Southeast. To me, he was a judge who had already decided I was guilty of the crime of being average. Growing up, I was the shadow that followed the sun. Tyler was the golden boy, the one who inherited the sterling height, the booming voice, and the innate ability to command a room. He was the varsity quarterback at Charlotte Country Day, who went on to get a business degree from UNC, while I quietly worked double shifts at a local diner to pay for my nursing prerequisites, despite my father's millions. The dinner had started with the usual posturing. My father sat at the head of the table, his $2,000 custom-tailored suit straining slightly at the shoulders as he held court. He was recounting Tyler's latest business venture, a luxury car detailing service that my father had funded to the tune of $200,000. Everyone nodded and smiled, offering practiced compliments. Then the conversation turned to me. Someone asked about my promotion to senior surgical nurse. I had barely mentioned the 60-hour weeks, the exhaustion of managing a trauma bay during a mass casualty incident, or the fact that I was now responsible for a team of 20 nurses. My father didn't even look up from his ham. Instead, he made a comment about how it was a shame I didn't have the brains for med school, how I was just a glorified maid in scrubs. When I finally stood up for myself, when I told him that my work saved lives while Tyler's work just made rich people's Porsches shine, that was when he reached for the kit. The Genetics Direct box was a stark, clinical white against the warm tones of the room. It looked out of place among the silver serving spoons and linen napkins. My father had bought it as a joke, a way to publicly humiliate me after months of him questioning why I looked so different from the rest of them. They were all tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of a winter sky. I was shorter, with darker hair and amber eyes that matched no one on the Sterling family tree. For years, the joke had been that the mailman must have stayed for tea. Tonight, the joke turned into an ultimatum. He wanted to prove that my defiance, my refusal to bow to his ego, was proof that I didn't carry his superior DNA. He wanted to see if I was even his, a statement that effectively erased 30 years of my existence in one breath. I looked at the kit. I looked at the plastic swab encased in its sterile wrapper. I thought about the thousands of times I had cleaned up blood and bile, the nights I had held the hands of dying strangers, and the way my father had never once asked me if I was okay. I thought about the tuition bills I had paid myself while Tyler crashed a brand new BMW M4 that our father replaced the next morning. The unfairness of it wasn't a dull ache anymore. It was a sharp, searing heat in my chest. I felt the weight of the 22 pairs of eyes on me, Aunts, uncles, cousins, all of them beneficiaries of my father's bank account, all of them too afraid to speak up. My mother remained silent, her gaze fixed on the wine. She had been a ghost in this house for years, a woman who traded her soul for a zip code and a jewelry box full of Cartier. I reached out, my fingers steady from years of suturing wounds under pressure, and I picked up the box. The cardboard felt cheap. I looked my father dead in his cold blue eyes. I didn't say a word. I simply opened the package, took out the swab, and scraped the inside of my cheek with a firm, deliberate motion. I placed the sample back into the vial, sealed it, and clicked the cap shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. I slid the kit back across the table. I didn't wait for him to respond. I didn't wait for the dessert course or the polite goodbyes. I turned around, grabbed my coat, a functional black North Face jacket that was miles away from the furs and cashmeres draped over the chairs in the hallway, and I walked out of that house. The humidity of the North Carolina night hit me as I stepped onto the driveway. My 2021 silver Honda CR-V sat parked at the end of a line of Mercedes S580s and Range Rovers. It was a reliable car, paid for with my own salary, and as I started the engine, the hum of the motor felt like a heartbeat. I drove away from the Sterling estate, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned. I was done being the outlier. I was done being the disappointment. Little did my father know that his cruelest joke, his attempt to cast me out, was the very thing that would pull the thread on the entire Sterling tapestry. He wanted a DNA test to prove I wasn't his daughter, but what he was going to get was a truth that would cost him every cent of that $90 million logistics empire. The next 3 weeks were a blur of 12-hour shifts at the hospital. I worked in the ICU, surrounded by the beeping of monitors and the smell of antiseptic. I watched families cling to each other in their darkest moments, and it only highlighted the void where my own family should have been. Every time my phone buzzed with a text from my mother, vague messages asking me to apologize to my father for causing a scene, I felt a fresh wave of resentment. They didn't care about the insult, they cared about the disruption to the dinner party. They cared about the optics. My father had probably already forgotten about the kit, assuming I had thrown it away or that the results would simply confirm what he already believed, that I was an inferior version of a Sterling. But the results didn't go to the house on Briarwood Lane. I had registered the kit with my own email and my own apartment address. When the notification finally hit my inbox on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria eating a lukewarm salad, I didn't breathe. I clicked the link. The PDF loaded slowly. I scrolled past the colorful charts and the geographical breakdowns. I went straight to the paternity match. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stared at the screen for a full minute, the noise of the cafeteria fading into a distant hum. The test didn't just show that I was Garrett Sterling's daughter. It showed that I was his only biological child. The golden boy, Tyler, the one who is currently being groomed to take over the company, the one who was living in a luxury condo downtown on our father's dime, was a 0% match to the man who worshipped him. The realization hit me like a physical blow. 30 years of being told I was less than, 30 years of being pushed to the side while Tyler was elevated, and the entire foundation of our family was built on a lie my mother had been keeping since before I was born. I looked at my hands. They were shaking now. I wasn't just a nurse. I wasn't just a disappointment. I was the heir to everything Garrett Sterling had built, and the brother who had mocked me my entire life was a stranger in our own home. I thought about the Thanksgiving table, the DNA kit sliding toward me, and the way they all laughed. The irony was so thick it was almost poetic. My father had handed me the weapon that would destroy him. He wanted to use science to humiliate me, but science had just handed me his crown. I didn't call him. I didn't text Tyler. I sat there in my blue scrubs, surrounded by the mundane reality of the hospital, and I felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me. I wasn't going to just tell them. I was going to wait. I was going to let the truth simmer. I thought about the $1,200 bracelet on Tyler's wrist and the $45 wine in my father's glass. All of it was built on a deception. Family isn't just about whose blood runs in your veins, but in a house where blood was the only currency that mattered, I had just become the only one with a full bank account. I stood up, cleared my tray, and walked back to the trauma bay. I had lives to save and a legacy to dismantle. My name is Cassidy Sterling, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what that name was worth. This was no longer about a dinner party insult. This was about the total collapse of the Sterling dynasty, and I was the only one who knew the walls were already falling. For 3 decades, I was essentially the unpaid intern of the Sterling family, a silent observer and tireless laborer in a house that treated my presence as a charitable tax write-off. While my brother Tyler spent his early 20s tearing through the streets of Charlotte in a $72,000 Arctic White BMW M4, a celebratory gift from my father for a business degree that took him 6 agonizing years and 3 tutor-assisted summer schools to barely finish, I was navigating the world in a 2014 Honda Civic with 184,000 miles on the odometer and a fan belt that let out a high-pitched, pathetic squeak every time I turned the ignition. My father, Garrett Sterling, the man who built and owned Sterling Structural Steel, a company that was currently netting a cool $4.2 million in annual profit, took a perverse kind of pleasure in making sure I understood the exact coordinates of my place in his hierarchy. It wasn't enough that I worked grueling 12-hour shifts at the trauma center, standing on the cold, hard linoleum of the surgical wing, until even my $160 medical-grade compression socks failed to keep the dull ache from settling deep into my marrow. I was also expected to manage the $42,500 mountain of student loans that they had refused to help with, despite the fact that Tyler's tuition at UNC had been paid in full up front, along with a monthly allowance that exceeded my nursing salary. Every Sunday afternoon, like clockwork, the performance of The Perfect Family began, and it was a production that required my manual labor. I was required to be at the estate by 4:30 p.m. sharp, not as a guest, but as a supplementary staff member. While the rest of the family gathered in the living room under the 12-foot ceilings to discuss their investments or Tyler's latest country club drama, I was in the kitchen prepping their perfect family dinner. I spent my 1 day off a week scrubbing the stubborn grease off the high-end Viking range, a professional-grade appliance that cost more than my first car, using industrial-strength degreaser that bit into the small nicks and cuts on my hands. I peeled organic potatoes, seasoned prime rib that cost $80 a pound, and polished the silver until my reflection in the spoons looked as tired as I felt. All the while, I had to endure the background noise of my father's voice drifting in from the other room, recounting my latest perceived failures, or casually reminding the extended family that I was a genetic disappointment, a phrase he used with such clinical detachment that it felt more like a diagnosis than an insult. The physical toll of being a senior surgical nurse is something most people cannot fathom unless they have stood in a trauma bay at 3 in the morning. But the emotional toll of those Sunday dinners was far more corrosive. I would arrive at the Briarwood Lane estate with my back still throbbing from assisting in an emergency thoracotomy, only to be handed an apron and told that the guest bathroom needed fresh towels and the crystal glasses needed to be hand-washed because the dishwasher left spots. Garrett would walk through the kitchen, his heavy footsteps echoing on the Italian marble tiles, and pause only to critique the way I was chopping the shallots or to point out a smudge on the stainless steel refrigerator door that I had supposedly missed. He treated me like a faulty piece of equipment that had somehow made its way into his high-specification life, a glitch in the Sterling brand that he had to tolerate but never accept. I remember one specific Sunday, just a few months before the DNA test incident, when the humidity in Charlotte was so thick you could feel it like a wet blanket against your skin. I had just finished a double shift, and my eyes were bloodshot from the fluorescent lights of the hospital. I walked into the kitchen at 4:32 p.m., exactly 2 minutes late because of a multi-car pileup on I-77 that had delayed my commute. Garrett was standing by the mahogany island, checking his gold Rolex Submariner with a frown that suggested I had just committed a felony. He didn't ask how my shift was, or if the patient we had been working on survived. He simply noted that punctuality was the mark of a disciplined mind, a trait he claimed was clearly absent in my half of the family tree. He then pointed toward a stack of dirty pans from the morning's brunch and told me to get started because the catered appetizers would be arriving soon, and he didn't want the kitchen looking like a slum. Tyler would usually wander in around 5 o'clock, smelling of expensive cologne and the leather interior of his BMW, to grab a beer from the Sub-Zero refrigerator. He would lean against the counter, watching me work with a smirk that communicated a profound lack of empathy. He would talk about the $300 steak he'd had the night before, or the new set of tailor-made golf irons he'd bought on a whim, never once offering to help, never once acknowledging that his sister was essentially acting as a maid for the family that gave him everything. To Tyler, this was the natural order of things. He was the sterling heir, the bearer of the legendary Garrett Sterling grit, while I was just the girl who did the work. He once joked, as I was kneeling on the floor to clean a spill of expensive balsamic vinegar, that I should be grateful for the exercise since my nursing job was probably just walking around with clipboards. I didn't respond. I couldn't. In the Sterling house, silence was the only shield I had left. The financial disparity was a constant grinding friction in my life. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment in a part of town where the sirens were a nightly lullaby, carefully budgeting every cent of my paycheck to cover my rent, my insurance, and the relentless interest on my loans. I bought my scrubs on sale and packed my lunches in reusable containers to save $10 a day. Meanwhile, my father's company was providing the structural steel for 3 new luxury high-rises in uptown Charlotte, contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. He would brag about the quarterly earnings over dinner, his face flushed with the pride of a self-made man, while I sat at the far end of the table, calculating if I had enough in my checking account to replace the balding tires on my Honda. He knew I was struggling. He knew exactly what my salary was because he had once looked it up, just so he could laugh at how little my time was worth compared to his. He told me that if I wanted a better life, I should have been born with better instincts, as if my lack of a trust fund was a personal character flaw I had chosen. My mother, Evelyn, was the silent enforcer of this dynamic. She didn't yell like Garrett did, but her disappointment was more surgical. She would look at my hands, red and chapped from the constant hand scrubbing required in surgery and the harsh cleaning supplies she insisted I use at the house, and sigh about how I was letting myself go. She would buy Tyler $500 cashmere sweaters for no reason at all, but when my birthday came around, she would give me a $20 gift card to a generic coffee shop and a lecture about how I needed to find a husband who could provide for me, since I clearly wasn't going to provide for myself. She moved through the house like a ghost of the woman she used to be, her entire identity wrapped up in the sterling name and the social standing it afforded her. She was the one who insisted on the Wedgwood china and the linen napkins that I had to iron by hand, creating a facade of elegance that masked the rot underneath. The irony of the unpaid intern label was that I actually knew more about the family business than Tyler ever would. While he was out spending his allowance at South Park Mall or at the bars in Epicenter, I had spent my teenage years listening to my father's phone calls, absorbing the language of logistics, supply chains, and labor costs. I understood the mechanics of his empire far better than the golden boy who was destined to inherit it. But in Garrett's eyes, knowledge was secondary to the image of the sterling man. He wanted a son who looked like him, spoke like him, and carried the physical markers of his lineage. Tyler fit the mold perfectly. He had the jawline, the height, and the casual arrogance that Garrett equated with success. I, with my average height and my features that didn't quite align with the sterling portraits in the hallway, was nothing more than a biological error that he was forced to house once a week. Every Sunday, I would drive back to my apartment in the silence of my squeaky Honda, the smell of degreaser and expensive beef still clinging to my skin. I would sit in my dark living room and wonder why I kept going back. Why did I subject myself to the humiliation? Perhaps it was a lingering hope that one day Garrett would see a successful surgery I had performed, or hear about the lives I had saved, and finally offer a nod of genuine respect. Or perhaps it was just the habit of a lifetime of being told I wasn't enough. I didn't know then that the DNA kit, that white box of clinical plastic and cardboard, was about to change the physics of my world. I didn't know that the man who called me a genetic disappointment was about to find out that his entire legacy was resting on the shoulders of the only person in the room he had taught to hate him. I was the one who scrubbed his floors. I was the one who paid her own way. And as it turned out, I was the only one who actually shared his blood. The intern was about to become the owner, and the bill for 30 years of unpaid labor was finally coming due. The betrayal happened on July 14th, precisely at 7:42 p.m., a time that remains etched into my memory with the clinical precision of a cardiac monitor's final flatline. The sun was setting over their 5,000-square-foot Georgian estate, casting long, predatory shadows across the manicured lawn that cost more to maintain each month than I earned in 3. The sky was a bruised purple and gold, reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows of the formal dining room, where the air was thick with the scent of rosemary-crusted lamb and the heavy, oaky aroma of the Macallan 12 my father had been nursing since the appetizers were served. Garrett had reached that specific stage of intoxication where his inherent cruelty sharpened into a theatrical edge, and he decided it was the perfect atmospheric moment for what he called a joke. He leaned back in his leather-upholstered chair, his face flushed from the scotch, and scanned the faces of the 22 relatives gathered around the mahogany table before settling his cold, predatory gaze on me. With a voice that carried the weight of a death sentence wrapped in a sneer, he announced to the entire room that since I looked nothing like a true Sterling, he was officially removing me from the Sterling Trust, a $1.5 million inheritance intended for my future, unless I could prove through biological certainty that I was actually his. The room didn't erupt in protest. Instead, it fell into a shallow, expectant silence that felt like the moment before a high-speed collision. He didn't just stop at the verbal threat. He reached into a bag at his feet and began handing out Genetics Direct DNA kits to everyone at the table as if they were nothing more than party favors at a grotesque celebration of my exclusion. The white and blue boxes slid across the wood, clinking against fine crystal and silver salt cellars. My mother, Evelyn, finally spoke, her voice a sharp hiss that lacked any real conviction as she whispered for him not to do this. Yet she made no move to physically intervene or defend her daughter. She simply reached up to adjust her $8,000 strand of South Sea pearls, her eyes darting away to focus on a distant point on the wallpaper, choosing the safety of her comfortable life over the dignity of her child. She was a woman who had traded her spine for a life of luxury long ago, and as I watched her avoid my eyes, I realized she wasn't just a bystander. She was an accomplice to the theater of my humiliation. Tyler, sitting directly across from me, found the entire spectacle intoxicatingly funny. He threw his head back and let out a loud, braying laugh that was cut short when he actually choked on a piece of his shrimp cocktail, his face turning a mottled red as he gasped for air while still trying to maintain his smirk. The golden links of his $1,200 bracelet rattled against the table as he pounded his chest, and for a fleeting second, I watched him with the detached curiosity of a nurse assessing a patient in respiratory distress, wondering if I would even bother to stand up if he truly stopped breathing. The air in the room was a suffocating cocktail of smells: the salt from the seafood, the overwhelming musk of my father's expensive Creed Aventus cologne, and the invisible but undeniable stench of their collective arrogance. It was the smell of old money rotting from the inside out, a scent I had been forced to inhale for 31 years while being told I should be grateful for the privilege of the suffocation. I looked down at the DNA kit that had come to rest near my water goblet. It was a sterile, clinical object that represented the ultimate rejection, a physical manifestation of my father's belief that I was a fraudulent interloper in his perfect lineage. My hands, which had spent the morning stabilizing a shattered femur in the trauma bay, were perfectly still as I reached out to touch the cardboard. I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me, the kind of stillness that comes when you realize the person you've been trying to please your entire life never actually existed. There was only this man, this small, insecure tyrant who used his wealth like a blunt instrument to keep everyone beneath him. I thought about the $1.5 million in the trust, a sum that would have cleared my student loans in an instant and secured a home for me, and I realized he was using it as a leash, a way to ensure my continued subservience even as he spat on my identity. He wanted to see me beg. He wanted to see me cry or protest, but I had seen too much real tragedy in the emergency room to be broken by a man with a scotch glass and a checkbook. I picked up the kit with a deliberate, slow movement that drew every eye in the room back to me. The plastic wrapper crinkled loudly in the silence, a harsh, modern sound in a room filled with antiques and tradition. My father watched me, his eyes hooded with a mixture of malice and drunken triumph, waiting for the moment I would break. He had spent years telling me I was a genetic disappointment, a dull shadow compared to Tyler's radiant sun, and now he was putting a scientific seal on that narrative. He truly believed that this test would be the final piece of evidence he needed to justify his lifelong disdain for me. I could see the reflection of the chandelier in his glass as he took another sip of the Macallan, his throat moving as he swallowed, his entire posture radiating the confidence of someone who had never been told no. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a verbal response or an emotional outburst. Instead, I stood up from the table, the chair legs scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound like a groan of structural failure. I tucked the kit under my arm, ignoring the way my mother flinched at my sudden movement, and the way Tyler finally stopped coughing to stare at me with wide, watery eyes. I looked at the 22 relatives who had spent their lives nodding along to my father's cruelty to keep their own places at his table, and I felt a profound sense of pity for them. They were all trapped in this 5,000-square-foot cage, while I was about to walk out into the cooling July air with the truth tucked under my arm. I realized in that moment that the DNA kit wasn't a threat. It was a key. It was the tool that would finally allow me to stop wondering why I didn't fit into this family and start realizing that I was never meant to fit into a space so narrow and toxic. As I walked toward the heavy oak doors of the dining room, I could hear my father calling out a final, mocking remark about how I should make sure to follow the instructions carefully because he knew how much I struggled with simple tasks. I didn't turn back. I walked through the foyer, past the portraits of Sterlings from generations past, who looked down with the same cold, judgmental eyes as the man currently sitting at the head of the table. I stepped out onto the porch, the evening humidity wrapping around me like a damp shroud, and I walked toward my silver Honda Civic. The contrast between the silent, echoing wealth of the house and the functional, worn-down reality of my car had never felt more pronounced. I threw the kid onto the passenger seat and sat there for a moment, the engine idling with that familiar, rhythmic squeak of the fan belt. I looked at the house one last time, the lights glowing warmly from the windows, masking the coldness of the people inside. July 14th, 7:42 p.m., was the moment they thought they had finally discarded me. But as I pulled out of the driveway, leaving the Sterling estate behind in the rearview mirror, I knew that the real betrayal hadn't even begun yet. They were so focused on proving I wasn't a Sterling that they had completely forgotten to look at the golden son who was still sitting at the table, laughing at a joke that was about to cost him everything. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of streetlights and highway signs, my mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. I thought about the clinical process of the test, the way the lab would break down the markers of my existence and compare them to the man I had called father. I wasn't afraid of the result. I was hungry for it. For years, I had carried the weight of being the outsider, the child who didn't quite match the family photos, the one whose interests and temperament seemed so alien to the sterling brand of aggressive materialism. If the test came back negative, I would be free from the burden of their expectations and the shadow of their name. If it came back positive, I would have a biological claim to the empire that Garrett used to belittle me. Either way, the power dynamic was shifting. I arrived at my small, quiet apartment, the contrast to the Sterling mansion making it feel like a sanctuary rather than a compromise. I sat at my kitchen table, a simple IKEA piece that didn't have a single drop of mahogany in its DNA, and I opened the kit. I followed every instruction with the meticulous care I used when prepping a surgical field, ensuring there was no room for error, no possibility of a contaminated sample. When the vial was sealed and the return envelope was ready, I felt a sense of completion. The trap was set, not by my father, but by the very truth he thought he could manipulate. I was no longer the unpaid intern or the genetic disappointment. I was the variable in his equation that he hadn't accounted for. And by the time he realized his mistake, the Sterling Trust would be the least of his worries. The empire was built on a foundation of structural steel, but it was held together by lies that were about to be dissolved by a single swab of saliva. It was 2:14 a.m. when the world as I knew it finally dissolved into a series of cold, digital pixels on a 5-inch screen. I was sitting in my car, parked under the flickering, buzzing yellow hum of a 24-hour Waffle House sign in a desolate corner of Charlotte, far away from the manicured lawns and silent security cameras of Myers Park. The interior of my silver Honda smelled like a depressing mixture of stale, lukewarm coffee from the hospital cafeteria and the sharp, lingering scent of antiseptic that seems to have bonded with my very skin after years of surgical rotations. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, broken only by the occasional rhythmic ticking of the cooling engine and the distant, lonely sound of a freight truck downshifted on the interstate. I held my phone in my hand, the screen's harsh blue light illuminating the dark circles under my eyes and the pale, exhausted set of my jaw. My hands weren't shaking. The years of holding retractors in high-stakes trauma cases had gifted me with a physical steadiness that felt almost disconnected from the emotional storm brewing in the pit of my stomach. I tapped the notification from Genetics Direct, entering my password with a clinical, detached precision, and waited for the PDF to load. When the document finally rendered, the status quo of my entire 31-year existence evaporated into the stale air of the car. I looked at the percentages, the genetic markers, and the names that were listed with such mathematical finality that they left no room for hope or denial. The data was irrefutable. I scrolled down to the paternity match section, my eyes scanning the high-probability match for Garrett Sterling. I was his. Every ounce of his stubbornness, every strand of his DNA was present in my blood. But it was the sibling comparison that made the air vanish from my lungs. Tyler, the golden son, the man who had been handed the keys to the kingdom while I was handed the bill for my own birth, had a 0% probability of being Garrett's biological child. The realization didn't come with a wave of sadness or a burst of hysterical laughter. Instead, it arrived as a cold, hard clarity. Loyalty, I realized in that moment, was a luxury I simply could no longer afford. I had spent 3 decades paying a debt of devotion to a family that viewed me as a liability, all while the real fraud was the one sitting at the right hand of the throne. I didn't cry. There were no tears left for a man who had used a DNA kit as a weapon of public execution at a dinner table. Instead, I reached into the center console and pulled out a crumpled, grease-stained receipt for a $4.50 breakfast, 2 eggs, toast, and black coffee that I'd eaten in a daze hours earlier. I flipped it over, found a pen in the glove box that still had a bit of blue ink left, and began to write with a focused, surgical intent. I didn't write a letter of grievance or a list of hurt feelings. I wrote down a list of assets, maneuvers, and targets. Bank accounts, legal counsel, the truth. I had been raised in a house where love was presented as a meritocracy, a prize to be won through performance and pedigree. But tonight I saw it for what it truly was, a scam, a psychological leverage tool used to keep the less fortunate members of the Sterling dynasty in their place. But numbers? Numbers were different. Numbers were cold, hard facts that didn't care about my father's temper or my mother's silent complicity. Numbers were the only language Garrett Sterling actually respected, and I was about to become fluent in his mother tongue. The glowing yellow sign of the Waffle House reflected off the hood of my car, and I watched a lone waitress through the window as she wiped down a counter with a tired, repetitive motion. We were the same, she and I, the invisible workers who kept the world spinning while the elite slept in their high thread count sheets. I thought about the $1.5 million in the Sterling Trust and the $42,000 of my own debt, and I realized the scale of the theft that had been committed against me. Garrett had attempted to disinherit his only biological child in front of 22 witnesses while subsidizing the lifestyle of a stranger simply because that stranger looked more like a Sterling was supposed to look. The irony was so sharp it felt like a scalpel. I began to calculate the logistics of the coming days. I needed a lawyer who wasn't on my father's payroll, someone who understood estate law and the specific, vicious intricacies of DNA-based disinheritance. I needed to move my modest savings to an account my mother couldn't track through her social connections. Most importantly, I needed to remain the disappointment for just a little while longer until the trap was fully set. The technical reality of the situation began to settle into my mind with the same weight as a medical diagnosis. In the state of North Carolina, the legal implications of a father contesting paternity only to find out the non-contested child was the illegitimate one were staggering. I knew that Garrett's will was structured around his bloodline. The Sterling structural steel empire was more than a company, it was a legacy he intended to pass down to his male heir. If Tyler was not a Sterling by blood, the legal foundation of his inheritance was built on sand. My mother Evelyn had sat at that table in her $8,000 pearls, watching her husband humiliate me, knowing all along that the son she protected was the evidence of her own betrayal. The stench of their arrogance, which had been so thick in the dining room, now seemed like a trail of breadcrumbs leading me toward their total destruction. I leaned my head back against the worn headrest of my Honda and watched the digital clock on the dashboard flip to 2:19 a.m. I thought about the 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country that my father drove, a vehicle that cost nearly $100,000 and was washed every Tuesday by a professional detailing crew. I thought about the way he gripped the steering wheel with the same entitlement he used to grip the lives of everyone around him. He believed he was the master of his universe because he had the most money and the biggest name, but he had just handed the only person with a legitimate claim to that name the means to take it all away. My mind raced through the Sunday dinners yet to come, the scrubbing of the Viking range, the polishing of the silver, the silent endurance of his insults. Only now, I wouldn't be enduring them. I would be collecting them as interest on a debt he didn't even know he owed. Every genetic disappointment he hurled at me would be another nail in the coffin of his reputation. Every time he praised Tyler's business acumen, I would think about the 0% on my phone screen and smile. The plan formed with a cold, terrifying efficiency. I would not reveal the results at the next family gathering. I would not scream the truth at my mother or throw the PDF in Tyler's face while he bragged about his Arctic White BMW. No, that would be too quick, too merciful. I would wait for the moment when the stakes were the highest. My father was planning to announce Tyler's official appointment as vice president of Sterling Structural Steel at the company's upcoming 35th anniversary gala. It was going to be a black tie event at the Ritz-Carlton, attended by the city's most influential developers and politicians. That was the stage Garrett had chosen for his crowning achievement, and that was the stage I would use to dismantle it. I wrote the word gala on the back of the Waffle House receipt, underlining it twice until the ink bled through the cheap paper. As the first hints of a gray, humid dawn began to touch the horizon over the parking lot, I felt a strange sense of peace. For 31 years, I had been searching for a way to belong, a way to earn a seat at a table that was never intended for me. I had worked myself to the bone, ignored the exhaustion in my muscles and the hollowness in my heart, all to prove I was worthy of the Sterling name. Now, I realized that I didn't need to prove anything to them. They were the ones who had to answer to me. I folded the receipt carefully and tucked it into the pocket of my scrubs, right next to my trauma shears and my stethoscope. I put the car in gear, the fan belt giving its signature high-pitched squeak as I pulled out of the parking lot. The sound didn't grate on me this time. It sounded like an alarm clock waking me up from a long, bad dream. I drove toward the hospital for my morning shift, passing the luxury condos downtown where Tyler was likely sleeping off a night of expensive scotch and unearned confidence. I thought about the patients I would see today, people whose lives were hanging by a thread, people who would give everything they had for one more day of health. Compared to the life-and-death reality of the trauma bay, my father's empire was nothing but a house of cards, and I was the wind that was about to blow it down. Numbers don't lie, and they don't have feelings. They don't care about family traditions or the color of a BMW. They are the ultimate truth-tellers. As I pulled into the hospital parking deck and saw the sun finally breaking through the morning fog, I knew that the Cassidy Sterling who walked into that building was not the same woman who had left the dinner table in tears weeks ago. That woman was dead, and in her place was a senior surgical nurse who knew exactly how to find the most vulnerable point in a structure and applied just enough pressure to make the whole thing collapse. Love might be a scam, but revenge? Revenge was a calculation, and my math was perfect. I didn't go to a cheap lawyer or some strip mall attorney who would be intimidated by the Sterling name. Instead, I sought out Marcus Thorne, a man whose reputation in North Carolina legal circles was as formidable as his physical presence. His office was located on the 42nd floor of a glass and steel high-rise in uptown Charlotte, a space that smelled perpetually of expensive Italian leather, polished mahogany, and $200 an ounce boutique tobacco that he likely imported from a private humidor in Havana. To secure his undivided attention, I paid his $5,000 retainer in cold, hard cash, a thick stack of $100 bills that represented 3 years of disciplined saving for a down payment on a house of my own. Money I had earned while working overtime in the trauma bay, while the rest of my family slept in silk sheets. Marcus didn't blink as I laid the money on his desk. He simply adjusted his silver cufflinks, leaned back in his ergonomic chair that probably cost more than my Honda, and listened with the predatory focus of a man who knew how to dismantle empires for sport. We spent the next 3 weeks digging through the digital and physical archives of the Sterling dynasty, performing a forensic audit on a life built on a foundation of structural steel and structural lies. I began pulling bank statements from the early 90s, specifically targeting the period surrounding Tyler's birth, and what we found was the first crack in the concrete facade. Hidden deep within the ledger of Sterling Structural Steel's general operating expenses, masked as a miscellaneous equipment lease, were series of payments totaling $112,320 funneled directly to a private medical facility in Switzerland in late 1993. This wasn't just a hospital visit. It was a high-stakes, off-the-books arrangement that predated modern transparency laws, and it coincided perfectly with the 6 months my mother, Evelyn, had allegedly spent at a wellness retreat to recover from prenatal complications. As we cross-referenced these financial movements with the notarized copies of birth certificates and the real DNA matches I had secured through the Genetics Direct portal, the reality of the situation became a mathematical certainty. My own match result was the first revelation that shifted the ground beneath my feet. It confirmed with 99.9% accuracy that Garrett Sterling was indeed my biological father, which meant his public humiliation of me at the dinner table was a betrayal of his own flesh and blood. However, the data also pointed to a man named David Riley, a 70-year-old retired boat builder living in a modest 2-bedroom house in Maine who was listed as my maternal biological uncle, a man my mother had claimed died in a tragic accident decades ago. The deeper we looked, the more it became clear that the Sterling family tree was not a sturdy oak, but a tangled web of deception designed to protect a very specific image of success. I spent my nights after work in Thorne's office, the city lights of Charlotte twinkling below us like a sea of diamonds as we went through boxes of subpoenaed documents and digital records that Marcus had a unique way of obtaining. I watched as he highlighted discrepancies in the Sterling Trust's amendments, noticing how the language shifted right around the time Tyler turned 18, as if Garrett was subconsciously, or perhaps consciously, securing the legacy for the son who looked like him, despite the growing financial inconsistencies in the family's private records. The fact that I was the only true Sterling by blood, and yet the most marginalized person in the family, was a bitter pill to swallow. But it provided me with the legal standing I needed to contest the trust and the very ownership of the company itself. My mother had clearly orchestrated a massive cover-up 30 years ago to hide a truth that would have ended her marriage and her access to the Sterling fortune. And she had used me as the scapegoat to keep Garrett's suspicion focused on the daughter who didn't look like him, rather than the son who did. But Tyler's results were the real nuclear bomb, the kind of information that doesn't just damage a reputation, but completely obliterates a legacy. When Marcus Thorne finally pulled up the secondary analysis on Tyler's genetic profile, the room went cold. The results didn't just show that Tyler wasn't a match for Garrett. They revealed a genetic marker that was a direct match to a man who had been Garrett's chief business rival in the early 90s, a man who had mysteriously disappeared from the industry after a hostile takeover that Garrett had led with suspicious ferocity. The irony was so dense it was almost suffocating. The golden boy, the heir apparent, the man being groomed to take over Sterling Structural Steel, was the biological offspring of the one man Garrett Sterling hated more than anyone else on Earth. It was a betrayal of such epic proportions that I almost felt a momentary flash of pity for my father. But then I remembered the DNA kit sliding across the mahogany table and the way he told me I should pay rent for the air I breathe. The pity vanished, replaced by a cold, surgical determination to see the procedure through to the very end. Marcus Thorne looked at me over the top of his glasses, his expression unreadable, and asked me how I wanted to proceed. He explained that we could quietly settle, taking a massive chunk of the trust and disappearing into a life of luxury, or we could wait for the anniversary gala and execute the plan in a way that ensured the truth could never be buried again. I thought about the Viking range I had scrubbed until my fingers bled, the $4.50 breakfast at the Waffle House, and the 31 years of being treated like a second-class citizen in my own home. I told him that I wanted the gala. I wanted the black tie audience, the developers, the politicians, and the local press to see the Sterling family for what it actually was. I wasn't just interested in the money anymore. I wanted the total and absolute redistribution of power. I wanted my father to look at the son he adored and see the face of his enemy, and I wanted my mother to realize that the daughter she had sacrificed to save herself was the one who was finally holding the gavel. For the next week, I continued to play the part of the dutiful, disgraced nurse. I went to the hospital, I worked my shifts, and I even went back to the estate on Sunday to prep the family dinner. This time, as I stood in the kitchen peeling carrots and seasoning the roast, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were a ghost haunting the halls of my own future. I watched Garrett drink his Macallan 12 and brag about Tyler's upcoming promotion, his voice booming with the misplaced pride of a man who thought he had won the game of life. I watched Tyler check his $1,200 bracelet and talk about the new luxury watch he was eyeing, oblivious to the fact that his entire identity was about to be stripped away like cheap wallpaper. My mother avoided my gaze as usual, her South Sea pearls reflecting the warm kitchen lights, her silence now reading to me as the desperate quiet of a woman who knew the ice was thinning but didn't know where the first crack would appear. Marcus Thorne's team worked around the clock to prepare the legal filings, ensuring that every piece of evidence was authenticated and every loophole was closed. We discovered that the $112,000 sent to Switzerland had been paid to a clinic specializing in high-end surrogacy and discreet paternity management, a facility that had since been shut down for unethical practices. This was the proof that the deception wasn't an accident or a mistake. It was a calculated, expensive investment in a lie. My mother had spent Garrett's own money to ensure he would have the perfect son he craved, effectively buying a legacy while discarding the reality of the child she actually bore. The paperwork for the injunction against Tyler's promotion was ready, the subpoena for the company's financial records was drafted, and the DNA reports were sealed in a leather portfolio that sat on Thorne's desk like a detonator. As the date of the 35th anniversary gala approached, the tension in the Sterling household reached a fever pitch, though I was the only one who truly understood why. Garrett was obsessed with the details of the event, spending thousands of dollars on floral arrangements and vintage champagne, wanting everything to be a testament to his strength and the continuity of his line. He even had the audacity to tell me that I could attend the gala, provided I stayed in the background and didn't mention the DNA test, as he didn't want any unpleasantness to distract from Tyler's big moment. He actually believed that his ultimatum had cowed me into submission, that the threat of losing my inheritance had bought my silence. He didn't realize that the girl he thought he could break was already gone, replaced by a woman who had spent a month in the dark with Marcus Thorne, learning exactly how to cut out a tumor without killing the patient. I spent the night before the gala in my small apartment, looking at the $200 dress I had bought with my own money. A simple, elegant black sheath that was a far cry from the extravagant gowns my mother and her friends would be wearing. I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't known in years. I wasn't the unpaid intern anymore, and I wasn't the genetic disappointment. I was the person who was about to tell the truth in a room full of people who had spent their lives profiting from lies. Numbers are cold, hard facts, and the numbers were finally on my side. Tomorrow night, at the Ritz-Carlton, under the crystal chandeliers and the watchful eyes of Charlotte's elite, the Sterling Empire would face its first real structural test. And as a surgical nurse, I knew better than anyone that when a structure is built on rot, the only way to save it is to tear it down to the foundation. My name is Cassidy Sterling, and by this time tomorrow, the world would finally know what that means. The nuclear bomb was in my hands, and I was ready to let it go. The heat of that Labor Day afternoon in Charlotte was a physical weight, a 92-degree blanket of North Carolina humidity that felt as though the very air were saturated with the scent of charcoal, expensive lighter fluid, and the rich, fatty drippings of $30 a pound prime ribeye. It was 5 o'clock on the dot, and the Sterling estate in Myers Park was humming with the calculated energy of 54 hand-picked guests, a collection of city council members, industrial developers, and the high society neighbors who spent their lives measuring their worth against the height of their hedges. I could hear the rhythmic, hollow thud of the tennis ball machine from the court and the distant, splashing laughter of children in the infinity pool, but my focus was entirely on the man standing at the center of the sprawling bluestone patio. Garrett Sterling was in his element, holding court behind a custom-built stainless steel Viking outdoor kitchen that cost more than my first 4 years of nursing school, wearing a ridiculous navy blue apron with King of the Castle embroidered in gold thread across his chest. He was laughing, his face flushed a deep, Scotch-induced crimson as he flipped the massive cuts of beef and bragged loudly about how Tyler was the only man with enough Sterling grit to take over the reins of Sterling structural steel by the end of the fiscal year. I didn't arrive in my usual reliable Honda Civic. I had parked it 3 blocks away, choosing instead to walk the final stretch to ensure I arrived with the cold, clinical focus of a surgeon stepping into a trauma bay. I wasn't wearing my scrubs or a summer sundress that would have helped me blend into the resort casual sea of linen and silk. Instead, I wore a black, impeccably tailored Hugo Boss suit that had cost me exactly 2 weeks of my take-home salary as a senior surgical nurse, a garment that felt like armor against the sweltering heat and the toxic atmosphere of my childhood home. As I stepped onto the patio, the click of my heels against the stone was a sharp, rhythmic punctuation that drew the eyes of the guests away from their half-empty glasses of chilled Chardonnay and craft beer. I wasn't carrying a side dish of potato salad or a bottle of wine to contribute to the festivities. I was carrying a single, heavy manila folder, the edges of which were crisp and white against my dark sleeve. The folder's contents were the culmination of 3 weeks of forensic investigation with Marcus Thorne, a collection of documents that didn't just contain data, but the complete and total demolition of the life Garrett Sterling had carefully constructed. When Garrett saw me, his laughter didn't stop, but it transformed into a sharp, predatory smirk that made the surrounding guests shift uncomfortably. He didn't offer a greeting or ask why I was dressed for a funeral in the middle of a heat wave. He simply leaned against the grill, the smoke swirling around his head like a dark halo, and projected his voice so that every person within 50 feet could hear his next barb. He called out, asking if I had finally received the results from the genetics direct kit he had forced upon me at that last disastrous dinner, using the word orphan with a casual, practiced cruelty that suggested he had already spent the afternoon convincing the guests of my illegitimacy. A few of the older relatives, the ones who had lived off Garrett's generosity for decades, let out nervous, tittering laughs, but the majority of the crowd went silent, the tension in the air suddenly exceeding the crushing pressure of the humidity. Tyler, who was standing nearby in a pair of $500 loafers and a crisp polo, raised his glass of imported lager in my direction, his expression a mask of smug satisfaction that mirrored our father's. They both believed they were witnessing my final act of desperation, a last-ditch effort to beg for a place at a table that was never mine. I didn't respond to the slur, and I didn't flinch under the collective gaze of 54 people. Instead, I walked with a slow, deliberate pace toward the center of the patio, moving past the caterers who were arranging trays of grilled asparagus and the tables draped in white linen that stood ready for the feast. My mind was a calm, organized space, much like the operating room before the first incision is made. I knew exactly where the arteries were, and I knew exactly where to cut. I could see my mother, Evelyn, standing near the outdoor bar, her fingers trembling as she adjusted her sunglasses, her body language radiating a frantic, silent plea for me to turn around and leave. She knew what was in that folder, even if she didn't know the specifics. She knew that 30 years of silence were about to end, and the pearls around her neck seemed to be choking her as she realized the daughter she had marginalized was finally the one in control of the narrative. The smell of the charcoal was suddenly overwhelming, a burnt, acrid scent that signaled the end of the Sterling era. The music playing over the outdoor Bose sound system, a curated playlist of upbeat yacht rock meant to evoke a sense of effortless success, felt jarringly out of place. I reached the center of the bluestone patio, directly between the grill and the long dining table, and I simply stood there, waiting. I looked at Garrett, really looked at him, noticing the way the sweat pooled in the creases of his neck and the way he gripped the silver tongs like a scepter. He was a man who believed that his wealth made him invulnerable, that his ability to buy silence and loyalty meant he would never have to face the truth. But as a nurse, I had seen the strongest men reduced to nothing by a single microscopic anomaly in their blood, and I knew that Garrett Sterling was no different. The silence that had started at the grill began to spread like a contagion through the entire backyard as guest after guest stopped their conversations to watch the woman in the black suit who was staring down the king of the castle. I waited for the track to change, and in the 3-second gap of silence between songs, I signaled to the young catering assistant near the sound system to cut the power. The sudden absence of the music was like a physical blow, leaving only the sound of the cicadas in the trees and the heavy, labored breathing of a man who had spent too much of his life shouting to get his way. Garrett's smirk began to falter, his eyes narrowing as he realized that I wasn't there to beg. I felt the folder in my hands, a tangible weight that contained the bank statements showing the $112,000 sent to Switzerland, the birth certificate of a man named David Riley in Maine, and the genetic evidence that Tyler was the son of the rival Garrett had spent a career trying to destroy. I wasn't just Cassidy the disappointment, or Cassidy the nurse, or Cassidy the orphan. I was the bearer of a reality that would redefine every person standing in that yard. The humidity seemed to peak in that moment, the air so thick I could almost taste the salt and the impending storm that was brewing on the horizon. I looked at the 54 guests, the people who had watched me grow up in the shadows, the people who had nodded when Garrett called me a failure, the people who had never once asked if I was okay. I didn't feel anger toward them anymore. I felt a profound sense of clinical detachment. They were just witnesses to a necessary procedure. I adjusted the folder, feeling the cool paper through the fabric of my suit, and I took a single step forward. The king of the castle was still holding his tongs, still wearing his apron, but the crown was already slipping. I thought about the 3 weeks of silence, the nights in Marcus Thorne's office, and the $4.50 breakfast at the Waffle House, where I had first decided that numbers were the only truth that mattered. Garrett had wanted a performance. He had wanted a public shaming to finalize my removal from his legacy, and I was more than happy to give him exactly what he asked for, though the ending of the show was one he had never rehearsed. Every detail of the scene was amplified in my mind, the way a single drop of grease sizzled on the grill, the way Tyler's knuckles whitened around his beer glass, the way my mother took a step back into the shadows of the porch. I was 31 years old, a woman who had spent her life being told she wasn't enough, and as I opened the folder, I realized that I didn't need their approval or their money to be whole. I just needed the truth to be as loud as the silence that was currently suffocating them. My name is Cassidy Sterling, and as the first raindrop of the coming storm hit the hot bluestone with a faint hiss, I looked my father in the eye and prepared to read the first page of the rest of our lives. The Labor Day BBQ was about to become the most expensive dinner the Sterling family had ever hosted, and I was the one who was going to make sure the bill was paid in full. The arrogance that had filled the air for decades was being replaced by something else. The cold, hard realization that the structure was compromised and the collapse was only seconds away. I cleared my throat, the sound echoing in the stillness, and I didn't start with a greeting or a question. I started with a fact. I started with the number $112,320. I watched as the color began to drain from my mother's face, a ghostly white that matched the pearls she had used to hide her secrets. Garrett didn't move. He stayed frozen behind his expensive grill, a king who was about to realize his castle was built on a graveyard of lies. This wasn't about revenge in the way people usually think of it, the screaming, the crying, the dramatic exits. This was a surgical extraction. I was here to remove the rot, and I didn't care how much it bled. The 54 guests leaned in, their hunger for meat replaced by a hunger for the scandal they could sense was unfolding. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the outlier in the Sterling family. I was the only person on that patio who knew exactly what was about to happen next, and the power of that knowledge was more intoxicating than any vintage wine or aged scotch. The stage was set, the audience was silent, and the truth was finally ready to speak for itself. "Attention, everyone," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, humid air with the clinical, unyielding steadiness of a stainless steel scalpel during a critical incision. I didn't use an ounce of emotion, and I didn't appeal to their sense of family or fairness. Instead, I used the only language these people truly worshipped, which was the cold, hard authority of data. "Garrett," I continued, my eyes locked onto his as the smoke from the Viking grill billowed around us like a funeral pyre. "You spent that dinner in July demanding proof of my bloodline, and you made sure everyone in this yard knew that my inheritance was contingent on my biological worthiness. So here it is." I began moving through the crowd with a practiced, efficient grace, handing out the 20 high-resolution copies of the Genetics Direct DNA report that Marcus Thorne and I had prepared, each one contained in a professional clear front report cover that caught the harsh glare of the late afternoon sun. I watched with a detached, surgical fascination as the color began to drain from my mother's face, her skin turning a translucent, waxy shade of ivory that made her South Sea pearls look dull and cheap by comparison. According to these results, which are authenticated and notarized by a third-party laboratory, I am indeed not your biological daughter, Garrett, and the man I share 99.9% of my genetic markers with is a retired boat builder named David Riley, who lives in a 2-bedroom cottage in Maine. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the 92-degree afternoon, leaving only the faint, rhythmic clicking of the grill's cooling metal. But as I watched Garrett's face begin to contort with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning rage, I realized I was only halfway through the procedure, and I pointed with a steady finger to the second page of the reports that were now being clutched by city council members and industrial developers. But here is the fun part, the part that actually impacts the future of sterling structural steel and the legacy you've spent 35 years building, I said, my voice rising just enough to command the attention of the 54 guests who were now staring at the documents in horror. Tyler, the golden boy, the heir apparent you are currently handing the keys of the kingdom to, the man who was supposed to carry the sterling name into the next generation, is not your biological son either. I let the words hang in the air, watching as Tyler's smug expression dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the probability of paternity listed as 0% next to Garrett's name. He is actually the biological son of Julian Vane, your former business partner whom you spent a decade trying to erase from the history of your company, and whom my mother was apparently seeing very frequently back in the spring of 1992 while you were away on that long-haul contract in Atlanta. The sound of a $120 Riedel Sommelier crystal glass shattering against the bluestone flagstone was the only noise that broke the stillness, a sharp, crystalline explosion that mirrored the total collapse of the sterling facade. Garrett's face, which had been a vibrant, Scotch-induced red only moments ago, underwent a terrifying physiological transformation, shifting through a series of sickly shades before settling on a terrifying ashen gray that signaled a massive, systemic shock to his 62-year-old heart. I watched him as a medical professional, noting the way his hands began to tremble and the way his pupils dilated as his brain tried to process the fact that every cent he had spent on Tyler's education, Tyler's BMW M4, and Tyler's $1,200 gold bracelet had been an investment in his greatest enemy's bloodline. Beside him, Tyler finally lost his grip on the heavy ceramic plate of honey-glazed ribs he had been holding, and it hit the stone with a wet, heavy thud, the dark, sticky barbecue sauce splashing upward and permanently staining the pristine white leather of his $850 Gucci Ace sneakers. He looked down at the mess on his feet with the confused, vacant stare of a man who had just realized he was no longer the king of the castle, but a stranger standing in a yard that didn't belong to him. My mother, Evelyn, didn't scream or protest. She simply collapsed into one of the wrought iron patio chairs, her body folding like a discarded gown, her hand going to her throat as if the weight of the lie she had carried for 3 decades was finally too much for her to bear. The guests, those 54 people who had come for the free ribeye and the proximity to power, were now looking at her with a mixture of pity and disgust, their loyalty shifting as quickly as the humidity-laden wind. I could see the local press photographer, who had been hired to document the transition of power to Tyler, lowering his camera in a state of utter disbelief, the digital screen showing the image of a shattered family instead of a corporate dynasty. The irony of the situation was a physical presence on the patio. Garrett had used the DNA kit as a weapon to prune the branch he didn't like, only to find out that the entire tree was a graft, a biological forgery that had been cultivated in the dark by the woman sitting in the chair beside him. He had spent years calling me a genetic disappointment and a failure, treating me like the unpaid intern of his life, while the son he worshipped was the ultimate betrayal of his trust and his pride. I stood in the center of the patio, the black fabric of my suit absorbing the heat of the sun, and I felt a sense of clarity that was more intoxicating than any inheritance. I looked at the man who had raised me, a man whose entire identity was built on the concept of structural integrity, and I realized that he was currently experiencing a total structural failure from which there was no recovery. The $90 million empire of sterling structural steel was suddenly a ship without a rudder, its designated captain revealed to be an interloper, and its founder revealed to be a fool who had been cuckolded in his own home. I thought about the $1.5 million in the Sterling Trust, a sum that seemed so small and insignificant now that the entire foundation of the family's wealth was being called into question. If Tyler was not a Sterling, and I was not a Sterling, the legal battle for the assets of the company would be a protracted, vicious war that would strip the family of everything they had worked to project. Marcus Thorne was already preparing the injunctions to freeze the company's accounts, and the documents I had just distributed were merely the opening salvo in a campaign that would leave the Sterling name as nothing more than a cautionary tale in the annals of Charlotte high society. The rain finally began to fall, not as a gentle mist, but as a heavy, sudden downpour that hissed against the hot surfaces of the grill and the patio, the water mixing with the barbecue sauce on the stone to create a dark, murky river that flowed toward the drain. The guests began to scatter, their expensive clothes getting soaked as they made a frantic dash for their luxury SUVs and Mercedes S580s, eager to escape the epicenter of the scandal before the fallout reached them. None of them looked back. None of them offered Garrett a word of comfort or Tyler a hand of support. They were people who followed the smell of success, and the Sterling estate now smelled only of charcoal and failure. I watched as my father reached out a trembling hand to steady himself against the Viking range, the king of the castle apron now a mocking costume for a man who had lost his kingdom in the span of 5 minutes. He looked at me, his eyes clouded with a desperate, animalistic confusion, as if he expected me to step forward and fix the damage with the same efficiency I used to fix a shattered limb in the trauma bay. But I simply stood my ground, the rain slicking my hair and cooling the fever of the afternoon, and I offered him nothing but the silence he had given me for 30 years. Tyler was still staring at the DNA report, his fingers leaving greasy rib sauce smudges on the crisp white paper, his entire world having shrunk to the 0% printed in the center of the page. He was a man who had never had to work for a single thing in his life, a man who believed that his last name was a shield that would protect him from the consequences of his own mediocrity. And now that shield had been shattered into 20 different copies and handed out to the neighbors. He looked at our mother, his face twisting into a question that she was too broken to answer, and in that moment, I saw the true weight of the unfairness I had endured. It wasn't just about the money or the cars or the tuition. It was about the fact that they had known. My mother had known the truth every single time she watched Garrett belittle me, every single time she stayed silent while he called me a genetic disappointment, and she had chosen to protect the lie because the lie was more profitable than her own daughter. She had sacrificed my childhood and my dignity to maintain her seat at the head of a mahogany table that was built on a foundation of adultery and deceit. The Labor Day BBQ was over, the 54 guests were gone, and the only people left on the patio were the 4 of us. 4 strangers who had lived under the same roof for decades, bound together by a name that no longer meant anything. The smell of the charcoal was being washed away by the rain, and the heat was finally breaking, replaced by a cold, sharp wind that rattled the leaves of the weeping willows. I realized that my name was still Cassidy, but the name Sterling now felt like a heavy, leaden weight that I was finally ready to drop. I had come to this house to perform a necessary operation, to cut out the rot that had been festering in my life since I was a child, and as I looked at the wreckage of the family I had once tried so hard to please, I knew the procedure had been a success. Numbers don't lie, and they don't have feelings, but they do have the power to set you free. I turned away from the man who wasn't my father, the brother who was a stranger, and the mother who was an accomplice, and I walked toward the edge of the patio, the manila folder empty, and my future, finally, for the first time in 31 years, entirely my own. The fallout was surgical, a swift and absolute dismantling of a dynasty that had been held together by nothing more than expensive mortar and systemic lies. Within 48 hours of that rain-soaked Labor Day massacre, Garrett Sterling had filed for a contested divorce, his rage directed with pinpoint accuracy toward the woman who had allowed him to bankroll another man's legacy for 3 decades. The sterling structural steel empire, once a $90 million titan of the Southeast, is currently being liquidated under the cold, watchful eyes of forensic accountants and court-appointed trustees to settle the staggering $2.8 million initial settlement and the mountain of legal fees that followed the revelation of corporate and personal fraud. Tyler, the man who had spent his life looking down at me from the leather seats of his Arctic White BMW, was summarily evicted from the luxury South End condo that Garrett's company had been paying for. Last I heard through the grapevine of former acquaintances, he is currently scrubbing rims at a high-volume car wash on the outskirts of the city and living in a $900 a month studio apartment where the walls are thin and the smell of industrial degreaser is a permanent resident. I didn't stay to watch the debris settle or to listen to the frantic, hollow apologies that my mother began leaving on my voicemail once she realized her South Sea pearls wouldn't pay for a defense attorney. I packed my life into my reliable silver Honda Civic, the squeaky fan belt finally replaced with my own hard-earned money, and I drove north until the humidity of North Carolina was replaced by the sharp, salt-heavy air of the Maine coastline. I no longer answer calls from any number associated with the name Sterling, having blocked every branch of that poisoned tree before I even crossed the state line. Before I went completely dark, however, I sent one final email to Garrett's legal team with an attached formal invoice for 15 years of domestic services rendered at the estate, calculated at a modest $25 per hour for the cleaning, the cooking, the silver polishing, and the administrative labor I provided under the guise of being a daughter. The total came to exactly $234,000, a figure that represented the literal cost of my stolen youth and the unpaid labor of a woman who was treated like an intern in her own home. I am now living in a small, sturdy house near the water in a town where no one knows my former last name, a place where the air I breathe is finally free of the suffocating weight of expectation, and the truth is the only thing ever served at my table. The transition from the high-pressure trauma bays of Charlotte to the quiet, rugged life in Maine was not an easy one, but it was a necessary shedding of a skin that had never quite fit me. I took a position at a local community hospital, a place where the patients are fishermen and local craftsmen, and where the value of a person is measured by the steadiness of their hands and the honesty of their word, rather than the brand of their car or the size of their trust fund. My mother tried to reach out once through Marcus Thorne's office, sending a desperate, tear-stained letter claiming she did what she had to do to survive in Garrett's world. But I didn't even finish reading it. I simply fed it into the wood-burning stove that heats my living room, watching the lies turn into harmless gray ash. There is a profound, almost spiritual peace in knowing that I am no longer a biological error or a genetic disappointment, but a person who chose to burn down a forest of deception in order to find a single patch of fertile, honest ground. Garrett's downfall was not just financial. It was the total psychological collapse of a man whose pride was his only foundation. As the liquidation of sterling structural steel proceeded, the local newspapers in Charlotte ran front-page stories about the scandal, detailing the paternity suit and the decades of financial mismanagement that my mother had facilitated to keep her secrets buried. The 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe was repossessed. The Briarwood Lane estate was put on the market for $4.8 million to cover the debts, and the king of the castle was left wandering through the rooms of a hollow house, realizing that the son he had built his empire for was the living proof of his greatest humiliation. I sometimes think about Tyler, standing on that blue stone patio with barbecue sauce on his Gucci sneakers, and I wonder if he ever realizes that his entire life was a performance in a play he didn't know was a tragedy. He wasn't the villain of the story, but he was the beneficiary of a crime committed against my childhood, and in the end, the truth didn't care about his innocence any more than it cared about my father's rage. In Maine, I spend my mornings walking along the rocky shore with a dog I adopted from a local shelter, A mutt with no pedigree and a heart made of pure gold. The cold Atlantic wind bites into my cheeks, reminding me that I am alive and that I am the only person who gets to decide what my name is worth. I think back to that 2:14 a.m. at the Waffle House, the yellow light flickering over my receipt as I wrote down the words, bank accounts, legal counsel, and the truth. And I realized that was the moment I actually became a surgeon. I didn't just save my own life that night. I performed a radical amputation of the parts of my history that were dragging me into the dirt. Loyalty to people who treat you like a burden is not a virtue. It is a slow-acting poison, and I am finally, for the first time in 31 years, completely and utterly sober. My house is small, a cottage with cedar shingles and a view of the lighthouse that blinks like a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the fog. Inside, there is no Wedgwood china, no Viking range that needs to be scrubbed on hands and knees, and no 22-foot mahogany table where judgments are passed over expensive Cabernet. There is just a simple pine table where I sit with my coffee, watching the sun rise over the ocean, knowing that every cent in my bank account and every stick of furniture in this room was earned through my own labor and my own resilience. I am no longer the shadow following the sun. I am the sun, and the shadows of the Sterling family are miles behind me, fading into the humid North Carolina past. The air here doesn't have a price tag, and it doesn't come with the requirement of subservience. It is crisp, clean, and entirely mine to breathe. Sometimes, when the hospital is quiet and I'm finishing a night shift, I look at my hands. The hands that Garrett said weren't good enough for med school, the hands that my mother said were too rough and chapped. And I see the hands of a woman who survived a war. I see the hands that held the truth when everyone else was clinging to a lie. And I see the hands that are currently building a life that is small, honest, and profoundly beautiful. The Sterling Trust, with its $1.5 million of blood money, is a ghost that I have exorcised, and in its place is a sense of self-worth that no amount of structural steel could ever support. I have learned that family isn't something you are born into with a guaranteed seat. It is a structure you build for yourself, brick by honest brick, with people who see your value without needing a DNA test to confirm it. I sent the invoice for $234,000 more as a statement of fact than an expectation of payment, though Marcus Thorne tells me that it might actually be recoverable as part of the liquidation process, since I was essentially an uncompensated employee of the household. Whether the check ever arrives or not is secondary to the fact that it exists on the record, a permanent testimonial to the reality of what it cost to be Cassidy Sterling. My father, Garrett, may have built bridges and skyscrapers, but he failed to understand the most basic rule of engineering. A structure is only as strong as its weakest point, and in his empire, the weakest point was the lie he used to hold his pride together. I am the one who found the crack. I am the one who applied the pressure, and I am the one who walked away while the whole thing fell. The silence of my new life is a luxury I never thought I would possess. There are no Sunday dinners to dread, no snide remarks about my car or my career, and no crushing weight of being the genetic disappointment. I am just Cassidy, a nurse, a neighbor, and a woman who knows her own name. If I had to go back to that July 14th dinner at 7:42 p.m. and do it all over again, I wouldn't change a single thing. I would pick up that cheap white DNA kit. I would scrape my cheek with that same steady hand, and I would wait for the moment when the truth finally walked into the room without knocking. Burning the family tree was the only way to clear the land for something real to grow, and as I look out at the main horizon, I know that the fire was the best thing that ever happened to me. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and the only person who stayed through the fire was the only person I ever truly needed. I am finally home, and for the first time in my life, the air is perfectly clear.